Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction, and it was amazing to hear the music over the break. And I'm thrilled to be talking now about the impact of oral history on AAPI individuals. And the way I'd like to start is just to describe myself, to tell you that I'm Korean American, and that puts me in a demographic group that sees higher median incomes than the national average. Or what I could do is to describe myself by telling my story, to tell you that I've been passionate about music my whole life, to tell you that in 5 years of being in Texas, I have not found a cowboy hat that fits my head. And to tell you that as an individual that's 5'7", I like standing on top of things to make myself look a little bit taller. These 3 vignettes tell you a lot more about me than the first slide. They're less empirically provable. I challenge you to try to prove any of these things objectively. And yet, you know a lot more about me from these. And I would like to bet that I have more credibility for this talk in your eyes after hearing this. And that's really at the core of what I hope to do today, to talk about oral history and how it can impact Asian American individuals, as well as the broader conclusions we can draw from this. And to take a step back, what do I mean by oral history? It really refers to the use of first-person narratives, of interviews, of these records of an interviewee telling their own personal, first-person, subjective story. And the way that I'll use it throughout this presentation is from the point of view of first-person storytelling. But where I want to apply it is to a problem known as the bamboo ceiling, a problem for Asian American individuals that statistics like these hide, where Asian American individuals are successful up to a point, but never quite make it to the top. And I break this down into 3 parts. First of all, negative stereotypes that contribute to these negative outcomes. Positive stereotypes that pigeonhole and put them in unfavorable situations. And finally, insufficient mentorship and networking. And really the way that I'd like to address this is by talking about how oral history can attack this problem on all 3 fronts. How it can, first of all, reframe these negative stereotypes, help us reconsider on an implicit level whether these should be seen as negative in the first place. Second of all, that it can help create vulnerability to crack open those positive stereotypes. And finally, that it can help inspire Asian American individuals through the presence of mentorship. So to start with our negative stereotypes, I think it's good to start with our implicit assumptions. Explicitly in leadership classes, we're told, for example, at the Door Institute, that there are many acceptable ways to lead. But this doesn't hold as much on an implicit level, where we tend to gravitate towards agency and aggressiveness, where we tend to gravitate towards the loudest voice in the room. And at the same time, Asian American individuals face negative stereotypes that say that they don't have assertiveness, that they don't have the agency and aggressiveness to have what it takes to be a leader. And as a result, this contributes to the bamboo ceiling. So why don't our implicit assumptions agree with what we explicitly know is to be true? A big part of this is how such assumptions enter our shared cultural identity in the States through stories. Consider, for example, this proverb from Japan that says the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. This says that you shouldn't be too assertive. And contrast that with this proverb from the States that says the squeaky wheel gets the oil. You need to be assertive. You have to make your voice heard. And as a result of this, stories like these unprovable anecdotes, contribute to what we believe on an implicit level. And if we want to change around those implicit biases, perhaps we need to start with the unprovable. And conceptually, theoretically, in terms of oral history academia, we talk about a sharing of frames of reference. The idea that this first-person point of view can help you accept the narrator's point of view and their value system. But if we take this a step further, we've seen this be applied in the workplace in terms of making a more ethical workplace environment. But how do we apply this to Asian American individuals? The way that we can do that is by telling stories of conviction, of where Asian American individuals display conviction in their values that don't agree with our implicit assumptions of what belongs. For example, from an agency and aggressiveness standpoint, telling stories of Asian American individuals that intentionally don't want to be that squeaky wheel, that don't follow what we would normally expect in a leader. For example, the story that David Kwan tells about other Asian American legal professionals that do not follow this. Or the story that Wen Miao Liu talks about, where she discusses the fact that she's aware of these stereotypes. She knows how they impact her. And yet her parents told her the turtle and rabbit story every day of her childhood, and so she adheres to it. She makes sure that her value focus is rather on not being too aggressive, not displaying excessive agency and assertiveness. Hearing such stories can reframe on that implicit level how decision makers think about different values. The next time they see an AAPI individual that doesn't display assertiveness in the way that they prototypically demand, instead of jumping to the automatic knee-jerk conclusion that that person lacks leadership skills, perhaps instead this reframing on the implicit level can interrupt their thought process just long enough for them to start thinking about whether it could be a different value system, whether that Asian American individual's values could be something as valid as our implicit assumptions. Now, I want to take similar ideas into positive stereotypes. The idea that positive stereotypes can pigeonhole from the point of thinking about cultural appropriation. But where this really becomes an issue from my focus on business and human resources is where AAPI individuals are promoted 2.5 times more frequently in failing businesses. The linkage we can make to positive stereotypes here is a model minority-esque one, where there's an implicit assumption that AAPIs are doing fine, that they're doing great, that they're great at being self-sacrificing, and thus serve as perfect tools for business turnaround. And this is not sustainable. This contributes to the negative impacts of the bamboo ceiling as well. So how do we solve this with oral history as well? Well, going back to the theoretical, the conceptual, oral history talks about a sharing of authority and specifically subjectivity. The concept that that narrator, that AAPI individual that's telling their first-person subjective story becomes the main character of that narrative. But how do we bring this about in practice? Part of it comes through physiology. The concept that when we hear first-person stories, when we hear these subjective experiences, we feel the exact same neurochemicals at play as being in love. Dopamine, endorphins, especially oxytocin. And when we hear these stories, thus, perhaps we can access similar kinds of empathy as when we are in love. Similar kinds of understanding, of wanting to understand a person beyond just a handful of preconceived notions, preconceived positive stereotypes. And the way that we can bring this about in practice, this holistic character development, can be, for instance, through stories of vulnerability, through stories where AAPI individuals don't have it all made. Robert G. is one of the most successful individuals I've ever seen documented in the Houston Asian American Archive, and yet he tells this story of how he still feels vulnerable, how he still feels he needs to prove himself a little extra in every room that he walks into. And again, going back to those implicit knee-jerk reactions that decision makers face, perhaps having heard such stories, it can interrupt that System 1 thinking just long enough to help them start considering whether it's conscionable to put an Asian American individual into a failing business, whether they're not thinking empathetically, holistically enough. That's the kind of thinking that we hope to set in motion with oral history. The third application of oral history is really not so much about the decision makers, but about Asian American individuals themselves. Individuals that feel that they do not have enough support to take on leadership roles at work, that feel that they don't see people that look like them in top leadership roles. And when we think about this, what oral history would say is that Asian Americans are not hearing each other's stories. So if, as we discussed earlier, there aren't enough Asian American individuals to begin with, then something that we can do is to first think about whether we can amplify the voices of those that exist. And this is critical because not only does it inspire, but it can also help show tangible roads to contextualization. Show aspiring young individuals how to get from point A to point B by hearing the subjective stories of those that went before them. But the most critical point that I want to highlight from a mentorship perspective is the idea that what if Asian American individuals don't feel comfortable networking, don't feel comfortable seeking out mentorship? This is something that I faced as a child. I did not feel comfortable reaching out to other API individuals because I was afraid of how that would make me be seen. I was afraid of how I would become more associated with positive and negative stereotypes if I spent a lot of time with other Asian Americans. I told everybody that I was awful at math, that it was my worst subject, because I didn't want to be associated with that stereotype. I was great at math. It was a lie, and I told it because I didn't want to associate with those stereotypes. And Robert G., again, tells a similar story of how he felt offended even that he was invited to join that API organization at his school. And what hearing such stories can do is critical because he also talks about how he had a change of heart, how he realized the importance of that network, the importance of reaching out. And perhaps what this can do for individuals like myself and others is help us realize that we're on the first half of this change of heart story, and what we need to do is get to the second half by reaching out, by seeking mentorship, by seeking community. But there's another important piece of this that I think is most critical when it comes to oral history, and that's the fact that a similarity between my story and Robert G's is that we were very aware of the positive stereotypes, the negative stereotypes, that made it feel unsafe to seek significant community with other Asian Americans. And so the image that I want to put into all of your heads here is if a horse goes to water, you take horse to water and it doesn't drink. Instead of blaming the horse for not networking and not seeking mentorship, perhaps what you can do is look at the river, realize that it's polluted with these negative stereotypes, these positive stereotypes. And what you can do is depollute that river through the use of oral history, as we discussed earlier, in terms of being able to reframe the negative stereotypes and break apart the positive stereotypes. So now I'd like to talk about the bigger implications of this. Some of this comes from my business perspective as somebody that is studying accounting now. I care about the fact that DEI matters in businesses through stakeholder theory, and also that we can access much higher returns for these businesses. The bottom line benefits, the communities benefit. Businesses should care more about this, and oral history is an avenue to doing so. But another important point that I want to bring up is that of allyship. Again, in my childhood, I also did not want to talk about my own problems from the perspective of being Asian American. I didn't want to talk about these issues because I felt it would hurt other groups, that bringing myself up would bring other groups down. And this is the theory that's been around for a long time. It has a name. It's called racial triangulation, a theory where minorities are pitted against each other with the narrative that if one benefits, the others will not. And this is a harmful narrative that we can start trying to crack by focusing on allyship, by focusing on the fact that when we feel safe to talk about our own personal, first-person, subjective lived experiences, when we normalize these things, we can create precedent for everyone to start talking about those subjective things, those points of vulnerability that may not be as easy to talk about from an empirical, facts-based perspective, but that are still equally important to our values and our perceptions. So how do we implement this? Part of this is just high level. When we think broadly about remaining aware of these things, essentially critical thinking. And from an educational perspective, we've seen that primary school students care more and more about these ideas. So if you're going into education, know that these first-person interviews can be incredibly helpful for you students. And on top of this, in our higher education context, part of this can come from trying to incorporate these interviews into what you do in research projects, in other projects. Because what I really want us all to come away from this today is these 3 use cases: reframing of the negative stereotypes, vulnerability to break apart the positive stereotypes, and finally, inspiration and the creation of safe spaces from a mentorship perspective. So to end, I'd like to read out just one more quote from somebody that I interviewed for the Houston Asian American Archive. She says that just thinking about something is not enough. You have to think about what you can offer. And so what I think we can all offer each other today comes on 3 planes when we think about equity and inclusion. First of all, what stories have I been told? Second of all, what stories do I hear being told by others? And third of all, what stories can I tell, and what stories can I retell? Thank you.